This week just gone, I was explaining to someone who is on a bit of a journey and the Bible is fairly new to them, and just explaining how the Bible is completely different to other. The other day I was walking down through Launceston, down through the main part there, and there was a group of cyclists there who were meeting on the sidewalk for a cup of coffee. And a part of their discussion as I was walking past was about what's happening in the Middle East now with the ISIS terrorism waged mainly at Christians in northern Iraq and Syria. One of the comments that was made as I was passing by was that these followers of ISIS were essentially just obeying the Qu'ran. And someone said, yes, but the Qu'ran is exactly the same as the Old Testament. I struggled not to chime in at that point because there was something I could have said, and it would have been something like this. In what way does the Qu'ran resemble the Old Testament of the Christian Bible? And here's probably, if I had the time, what I would have pointed out. And it does reveal to me that perhaps a lot of people who approach the Bible for the first time and read the Old Testament will struggle to appreciate what's going on here. Let me just show you something. The Old Testament is comprised of sections, and each of these sections are largely telling a story. In fact, what we're doing is we're following the story, the history of a person who became a nation. That person was Abram, who became Abraham, and from Abraham, the nation of Israel was formed. And the Old Testament essentially narrates that story. And this is how it does it. The first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, tell the story of the creation and all the way through to the selection of a man who was to become a nation. Then that nation is given a set of laws, the 10 Commandments. That's the first 5 books. Then we have the history of that nation being developed. As they take possession of the land that was assigned to them, to the appointing of kings, and we have Joshua all the way through to 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. And Kings and Chronicles sounds similar, but it's actually different in the sense that the 1st and 2nd Kings detail the history of the kings of Israel, even beyond their civil war, where the north split from the south, but Chronicles just gives the details of the southern 2 tribes, which was Judah and Benjamin. They became known as Judah. So that's the history component, and then we come into the poetic component, the poetry component of the Old Testament. This includes Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to read it and just enjoy it for poetry. Wisdom literature, little gems of wisdom on how to live wisely and get along with others and get along in life. So a lot of wisdom here in the poetry section. And then we've got this section here, the prophets. And the prophets section is divided into 2. There's the major prophets and the minor prophets. Not because of importance or the weight of the matter with which they deal, but simply because of the size of their books. So we have Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah being the major prophets, and then we have Daniel and Hosea and the rest of them largely considered to be the minor prophets. So that's the close of the Old Testament. And in those first 5 books is almost the DNA code for the rest of the Bible. You'll find in those first 5 books nearly everything Jesus said. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. It's actually in the law. You'll find God is merciful and gracious. You find that in those first 5 books. Pretty much all of the concepts that get unpacked throughout the rest of Scripture there. And you find in those first 5 books some strange references which we will deal with a little bit later on in this series in Ezekiel,